They made her sit on the edge of the platform apart from the others. The younger girls stood in bright dresses, their hair curled, eyes lowered. She had no dress, no ribbon, no name card on her chest. Only a tag burned into the wood beside her feet that read, "Too ugly to marry." Some men laughed. Some didn't look at all. Her hands were folded in her lap like they were trying to disappear. The auctioneer didn't bother describing her. Just moved on. And she sat there in silence with dust in her hair and shame in her throat, watching the sky turn from gold to red. No one raised a hand. Until one man, near the back, in a coat dusted with road and rain, slowly lifted his arm. He didn't look like the others. And he never took his eyes off her. The wind carried the scent of dust and old horses, sweeping through the edge of the fairgrounds like an uninvited guest. It tugged at the canvas banners, rattled the auction boards, and pressed against the sunburnt faces of those who came not to bid, but to watch. The auction block had been dragged into the center of the square, a crude wooden platform raised just high enough to make the girls visible to the crowd that stood in boots and spurs, chewing tobacco and squinting into the late afternoon sun. She was already seated when the crowd began to gather. They hadn't let her stand with the others. The other girls, 6 of them, dressed in colors that tried to catch the light, had been told to smile, to bow their heads slightly when their names were called. But not her. She had no nameplate, no instructions, no family member to whisper last-minute advice. Just a faded cotton dress and a splintered bench nailed to the far side of the platform where someone had etched a single word with a pocket knife, "Ugly." She sat very still. Not frozen, not afraid exactly, just resigned, as if her body had learned long ago that any movement might provoke a reaction. Her back was straight, her hands folded in her lap. Her hair, once thick and black, now hung in uneven lengths down her back, dull with dust and tangled from neglect. She had washed her face that morning in a horse trough but found no mirror. There had been no point. The auctioneer's voice rang out, thick and theatrical, announcing each girl like a show horse. He shouted names and listed features: height, age, sewing skill, potential fertility. The crowd responded in grunts, whistles, and the occasional offer. Coins changed hands. Ownership shifted. And with each final clap of the gavel, another girl stepped down from the block and was led away. But not her. The auctioneer didn't mention her. Didn't point. She wasn't introduced, just left sitting there like furniture, like something someone might claim later if no one else did. The tag at her feet did all the talking. It had been carved into the wood by a cruel hand and left to bake under the sun, "Too ugly to marry." She had seen it that morning, had wanted to scrape it off. But the blade she carried had been taken away before they brought her here. The sun dropped lower, casting the platform in long slashes of shadow. The last of the girls had been taken. The crowd began to thin, the excitement draining now that the prettier ones were gone. Boots shuffled. Horses neighed. Someone laughed behind their hand. A few men glanced her way only to turn again, their expressions unchanged. She was background. An afterthought. And then she heard it. A pause. A quiet that spread slowly like water seeping through wood. One man at the back of the crowd had not left. He stood apart, half hidden in the shadow of the feed store. He wore a duster that had once been brown but now carried the road in its folds, mud, ash, and something darker. His hat was pulled low, but his gaze was visible beneath it. He was looking at her. Not around her. Not through her. At her. He raised his hand. Not fast. Not flashy. Just a slow, deliberate motion as though it took all the weight of the world to lift it. The auctioneer turned, surprised. There was no price shouted. No haggling. No laughter. The crowd, what was left of it, stood in stunned silence. And in that silence, something shifted. The sun touched the edge of the hills, and the light on the platform turned gold. She didn't move. The man said nothing. He simply stepped forward and handed over a coin. It wasn't much. Maybe it wasn't even required. But he gave it anyway. Then he walked to the edge of the platform and waited. She stood. Not because she trusted. Not because she hoped. But because she couldn't bear to stay sitting one more minute under that word. She stepped off the platform, boots landing in the dry earth, her knees barely steady, and walked toward him. The crowd melted away. No one spoke. No one followed. As they crossed the edge of the fairgrounds, the wind rose again, catching her dress and the ends of his coat, lifting the dust in little spirals around their feet. The sun dipped fully behind the hills. Evening arrived in violet streaks. He did not reach for her. He did not offer his name. But when she glanced sideways at him, uncertain, waiting for the familiar sting of shame or cruelty, she saw none. Only stillness. Only someone who had seen enough of the world to know what not to say. They walked on, away from the square, away from the laughter that still echoed faintly behind them, and into a silence she had never known before, one that did not punish or belittle or forget. A silence that held room for her. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't ask. But for the first time in years, she wasn't walking away from something. She was walking toward it. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of pale dust, winding through golden grass and scattered oaks, the sun now fully set behind them, casting the landscape into soft layers of blue and gray. The man walked with a steady rhythm, his boots silent against the earth. She followed beside him, her steps slower, uncertain, her thin shoes barely protecting her feet from the rocky soil. Neither of them spoke. The quiet was not awkward. It simply existed, like the air or the fading light, a presence that asked nothing of them. The town had disappeared behind a low rise, swallowed by distance and darkness. She didn't look back. Her shoulders ached from tension that hadn't yet left her. Her hands, balled into fists for most of the day, finally started to ease. She could still feel the wooden bench against her spine, the heat of the sun on her neck, the sting of 100 silent judgments. Those things clung to her like burrs. But step by step, they began to loosen. The cowboy carried nothing but a satchel slung across his back and a flask tied at his side. He walked like someone used to distance, his gaze never scanning or searching, just forward. Occasionally he would glance to the sky, noting the darkening clouds, the shift in wind. She watched his movements carefully, unsure what to expect. He had not touched her. Had not demanded anything. That in itself was foreign. As night thickened, the stars emerged, scattered and brilliant above them. A soft wind moved through the grass, brushing her legs and lifting the hem of her dress. The air grew cooler and she hugged herself, teeth beginning to chatter. He noticed but said nothing. He simply stepped aside and unclasped the coat from his shoulders, offering it without gesture or insistence. She hesitated, then reached for it, wrapping the heavy fabric around herself. It smelled of leather and ash, worn with use but warm. Beneath it, her shivering eased. They reached a small rise where an old fence stood, its rails broken and sagging, surrounding nothing but prairie. Beyond it was a thicket of trees, and nestled within them, almost hidden, stood a cabin. It was rough, single-roomed, with smoke curling from a crooked chimney. A single lantern glowed faintly inside, casting a golden pool of light that spilled out onto the steps. He led her toward it without a word, opening the door with a quiet creak. The interior was sparse but clean. A bed pushed against one wall, a stove in the corner, a table with a single chair, and a shelf holding a few tins of food and a kettle. The floor had been swept recently. A small basin set near the stove, water half filled from some earlier time. It wasn't much, but to her it looked like shelter, like a space that had been lived in, not passed through. He pointed to the bed, then moved to the stove, adding wood and coaxing the fire to life. She watched him, uncertain whether to sit, to move, to speak. Eventually, she sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers clinging to the coat, her back straight as a board. The warmth of the room crept toward her slowly, sinking into her skin, making her realize just how cold she had been. The fire caught. The light flickered across the cabin walls, making the shadows dance gently. He placed a small pot on the stove and poured in water from a jug, adding something from a tin. The scent of beans and salt filled the space. Her stomach clenched sharply, reminding her how long it had been since she last ate. She didn't move. Hunger was familiar. Hunger could be endured. When the pot steamed, he filled a chipped bowl and set it on the table before returning to the fire. She hesitated only a moment, then stood and crossed the room. Her hands trembled as she picked up the spoon. The first bite burned her tongue, but she didn't care. She ate slowly, not ravenously, as if afraid she might lose it if she rushed. He never looked at her while she ate. He tended to the fire, adjusted the kettle, and then settled into a spot on the floor near the wall, unrolling a thin blanket. She stared at him, confused. There was space on the bed. He could have claimed it as many would. Instead, he laid down on the wooden floor, pulled the blanket over himself, and closed his eyes. His hat still rested on his head. His boots remained on. A man ready to rise at any moment, to move again, to disappear. She didn't speak. Didn't thank him. She simply stood there in the middle of the cabin, unsure if what was happening was real. The coat still draped around her. The bowl sat empty on the table. The warmth had reached her bones now. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, no one was watching her. No one was waiting for her to fail, or to obey, or to disappear. She walked to the bed again, laid down on the far edge, keeping the coat wrapped tight. Her body curled instinctively as if bracing for something. But nothing came. Only the soft sounds of the fire, the creak of the wood as the cabin settled, and the slow, steady breathing of the man who had bought her, not for beauty, not for obedience, but perhaps, though she didn't yet dare believe it, for something else entirely. She watched the firelight flicker across the beams overhead, her eyes heavy but her mind wide awake. The tag still burned in her memory, seared into the back of her thoughts, too ugly to marry. She had carried it like a brand, worn it like armor. But in this room, in this silence, it began to peel. Not all at once. Just a little. Like a scab lifting from skin that might yet learn how to heal. And somewhere deep in the folds of sleep, before her mind fully drifted, she realized that the bed was soft. That she was warm. That no door had been locked behind her. And that the man who had raised his hand not for what she was called, but for something he had seen, had never looked at her with pity. Only with recognition. Under the pale hush of morning light, the cabin began to stir. The cold hadn't fully left the room, lingering in the corners like a ghost reluctant to surrender. Outside, a pale mist clung to the earth, rolling low and slow across the grass like breath. The first rays of sun had yet to pierce through it, casting the world in a blue-gray stillness. Birds began to murmur from hidden branches, not yet singing but aware that the day had begun. Inside, she awoke not with a start, but with the confused softness of someone unsure of where she was. The blanket twisted at her ankles, and for a moment she stared at the beams overhead, not moving, not blinking, just breathing. Her body felt heavy, not from exhaustion, but from unfamiliar rest. The ache in her limbs was dull now, less sharp than it had been. Her fingers no longer curled with tension. She sat up slowly, brushing tangled strands of hair from her face. The coat had slipped from her shoulders during the night but remained gathered at her side like a silent guardian. The air was cool but not biting. She wrapped it around herself again out of habit more than need. He was no longer on the floor. The blanket lay folded neatly, the fire rekindled with fresh wood, its warmth rising steadily into the room. The pot sat back on the stove, steam curling from its edge. She could smell oats. Something simple, hearty, and kind. It almost felt like memory, though she couldn't place from when. A bowl had already been set on the table for her, the spoon resting carefully inside, not as a gesture but as routine, as if this were simply how mornings worked here. She rose and crossed the floor, her bare feet pressing into the cool wooden boards. She ate slowly again, not because of fear this time, but because her stomach still didn't quite trust the idea of fullness. Each bite was quiet, the silence around her no longer empty, but oddly generous. He was outside, she realized, as she caught sight of his silhouette moving past the cabin window. Beyond the mist, his figure was a shape of motion, carrying a bucket, checking the fence, tending to the horse. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. Just the work of the day beginning. After she finished, she rinsed the bowl in the basin, the cold water biting at her fingers. She moved carefully, uncertain what to do next. There was no list of chores, no barked command. No one waiting with a switch in their hand. She stood in the center of the room, feeling the open space around her like a question. Then she stepped outside. The air hit her chest with a chill, but she didn't flinch. The landscape unfurled before her like a painting that had always existed, just hidden behind some curtain of grief. Hills rolled softly into the distance, dotted with patches of trees that swayed in the light breeze. A lone hawk circled overhead. The horse snorted gently from its place by the post, tethered loosely, its ears flicking toward her. She hadn't touched a horse in years. Not since her uncle's ranch, and even then, never alone. He was crouched near the well, checking the pulley rope for wear. When he saw her, he didn't startle or call out. He simply nodded once and returned to his task. That single motion grounded her. She stepped forward slowly, as if testing the boundaries of some invisible wall that had kept her tethered to shame for so long. Each step was cautious but steady. There was no need for words. He didn't ask questions. She didn't offer stories. In that strange shared silence, something began to mend between them, not as man and woman, not even as protector and protected, but as two souls who had survived different kinds of abandonment. He finished with the well and handed her the bucket. She took it without hesitation and carried it back to the cabin. It was heavy, but she didn't complain. The strain in her arms felt good, real, proof of usefulness. She poured the water into the basin, careful not to spill. Throughout the day, they moved like this, separate but near, each tending to small, ordinary things. She gathered firewood from a pile, stacking it inside. He swept the porch. She found a brush and began gently cleaning the corners of the cabin where dust had gathered. It wasn't out of obligation. It was instinct, a quiet offering to the space that had offered her peace. He noticed, but didn't comment. Just as she noticed the way he adjusted the fence post twice, even though it stood firm the first time. He was nervous, perhaps, or simply used to fixing things before they broke. By midday, the sky cleared completely. Sunlight poured over the land, revealing all its honest details: pebbles in the dirt, scars in the wood, the curve of her shadow against the cabin wall. She watched the way the light shifted over her arms, noticing again the bruises that had started to fade, the calluses on her hands from years of hard labor. She didn't hide them. For once, there was no one to hide them from. They shared a quiet meal on the porch, passing a plate between them. He handed her a slice of dried apple. She took it with a small nod. And though no words were spoken, a rhythm began to form, one of coexistence, of mutual respect. She didn't yet know where it would lead. She didn't ask what he expected. The silence between them had never felt so sacred. When the sun began to set again, casting the hills in copper and fire, she found herself standing at the edge of the fence, staring at the horizon. The sky, wide and merciless, now felt like something she could face. Behind her, she heard the door creak softly. The sound didn't frighten her. Not anymore. Not here. Inside the cabin, the fire was already lit. Her coat had been folded. Her place was waiting. She stepped over the threshold not as someone who didn't belong, but as someone who had found shelter. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of home. The days moved forward with the slow dignity of the land itself, each one brushing gently against the next, like wind through the prairie grass. There were no sudden changes, no declarations of intent or trust. Only the quiet repetition of shared space, the rhythm of life beginning to pulse around her in small, steady beats. Each morning, she woke to the scent of firewood and oats, the distant sound of his boots outside. Each evening, she lay down on the same side of the bed, the same blanket pulled to her chin, the warmth now familiar. He never crossed into her space. He never watched her with expectation. That, more than anything, allowed something hidden to breathe again. The part of her that had shrunk over the years, flattened by stares, by whispers, by silence, began to rise slowly from within, like a shoot pushing through packed earth. She had been called ugly. She had been labeled unwanted. She had been bought, dismissed, and forgotten. But here, in this stillness, none of those words held shape anymore. They had nowhere to live in. She began to notice details about the cabin that she hadn't at first. The small carvings etched into the wooden bedpost, marks made by boredom or memory. The way the floor dipped slightly near the stove. The tin cup with a dent in its side, always turned inward on the shelf as if hiding its flaw. Even the old rocking chair on the porch, whose right leg scraped just slightly louder than the left. These were imperfections, but none of them were rejected. They belonged. One morning, while gathering wood behind the cabin, she spotted something strange in the dirt. A cluster of flowers, wild, tiny, yellow and white, growing up through the cracked earth beside a log. They were defiant in their smallness, blooming with no audience, no tending. She knelt down and brushed her fingers across them. They reminded her of something she'd once felt as a child before the cruelty of adults had wrapped itself around her throat. The image stayed with her all day. That afternoon, while he was out riding along the fence line, she took the small chipped mug from the shelf and filled it with water from the basin. She returned to the spot and carefully dug the flowers free, placing them inside the mug and setting them on the windowsill. It wasn't a bold gesture. It wasn't meant to be seen. But when he returned and glanced at the window, something softened in his shoulders. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The weather grew warmer. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust. Birds nested in the beams above the porch. Life returned to the land and in some quiet way to her as well. She began to hum sometimes while sweeping the floor or washing the dishes. Nothing melodic. Just fragments of breath against silence. She noticed that when she did, the space felt lighter. She watched him from a distance too. The way he treated the horse, not with command but with understanding. The way he stopped when passing a broken fence post as if listening to what it needed. He was a man of few words, but his movement spoke. In every gesture, there was patience. In every pause, there was room. One evening, while folding linens, she caught a glimpse of herself in the small piece of mirror nailed crookedly to the wall. It had once been a shard of something larger, perhaps broken in haste or dropped in a moment of carelessness. The image it returned was warped slightly, the edges blurred. She leaned closer. What she saw was not beauty as the world defined it. Her jaw too strong, her nose slightly bent from a childhood accident. Skin darkened by sun, hands roughened by labor. But her eyes, they were no longer hollow. There was something in them now, an ember, faint but alive. She touched her cheek, surprised at the softness beneath her fingers. Not because it had changed, but because she hadn't noticed it before. Later that night, as the wind pressed against the cabin and the stars blinked above like watchful eyes, she lay awake listening to the creak of the walls. The silence wrapped around her not like a void, but like a blanket. Outside, he stirred, moving something on the porch, adjusting the chair perhaps. She closed her eyes and let the sound settle into her chest. It didn't frighten her. It didn't hold threat. For the first time in years, she thought about a future, not a plan, not a dream, but a simple continuation. Another morning. Another flower. Another bowl of oats shared at the table. There was no map. No goal. Just the slow, unfolding trust of a life no longer stolen from her. In this place, beneath this roof, no one had told her what she was worth. No one had asked her to prove she belonged. And perhaps that was the miracle. That in a world that had once reduced her to a label, she was now simply herself. And that was enough. The wind sighed against the walls like an old story being told. And somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, she let herself believe that healing might not come with thunder or fire, but with stillness, with breath, with the silent hand of time. The rain came in the early hours, slow and steady at first, like a whisper tapping gently on the roof, before deepening into a rhythmic drumming that blanketed the land. It painted the world in shades of gray and silver, pulling the light down low and soft, blurring the edges of the hills and the fence lines. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire pushed against the cold seeping through the walls, casting a flickering orange glow across the room. She sat by the window, legs curled beneath her, watching the rain streak the glass. The cup in her hands had gone cold, but she didn't move to refill it. Her eyes followed the droplets as they slid down the pane, merging and splitting like rivers on a map. Outside, the earth had turned to mud, the horse sheltering under the awning, unmoving, accepting. The world was quieter in the rain, as if the sky had placed a hand over everything and asked for silence. Behind her, the floor creaked as he crossed the room. She heard the faint clink of a kettle being lifted, water being poured, wood shifting in the stove. These sounds no longer startled her. They moved around her like background music to a life she was starting to believe might remain undisturbed. There was no threat here, no punishment lurking in the corners. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in. That morning, he didn't go out riding. Instead, he pulled a worn oilskin coat from a hook and hung it near the door. His tools remained untouched. The day would be slow. A day for repairs, perhaps. Or nothing at all. Sometimes, doing nothing was more healing than anything else. She picked up a bundle of fabric from the corner, scraps from an old shirt he had offered her days ago when he noticed her shivering near the fire. The material was rough but warm, and she had begun cutting it into squares. She didn't know why. There was no plan. Only the comfort of doing something with her hands. She stitched slowly, the needle moving in and out, a rhythm she found without instruction. Her fingers remembered the motion even if her memory of learning it was long buried. He brought her another cup of tea and placed it on the table without speaking. The steam curled between them. She didn't look up, but she felt the gesture settle gently into her chest like a small weight she was willing to carry. He returned to the chair near the hearth and began sanding a piece of wood, his movements careful and unhurried. The room filled with the scent of pine and the faint rasp of grit on grain. They were two people in a space, sharing air, sharing time, not bound by obligation but by a growing, unspoken ease. At midday, the rain softened and the world beyond the window became more visible again. She saw the shapes of trees, the outline of hills, the faint shimmer of puddles collecting along the path that wound past the barn. A bird flew low across the field, wings heavy with water. She wondered how far it had come, how long it had searched for shelter before finding one. Later, she opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cool, damp with the breath of the storm. Her boots sank slightly into the earth and water soaked the hem of her dress, but she didn't care. She tilted her face to the sky and let the rain touch her. Not a punishment. Not a curse. Just water. Just weather. Her arms stayed by her sides, but her eyes closed, and for a moment she simply stood there, unhidden, unafraid. He watched her from the porch, a quiet presence behind her. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask if she was cold or if she needed anything. He simply let her be. And in that stillness, in that permission, something inside her clicked into place. She was no longer waiting for the world to collapse. No longer bracing for the voice that would cut through calm like a knife. She was beginning to trust the quiet. That evening, she dried off and changed into the cleanest dress she had. She combed her hair carefully, pulling it back with a strip of cloth she'd cut from the same bundle of scraps. She looked at herself in the piece of mirror again and didn't flinch. The woman staring back was tired, yes, but she was upright. Present. There was no shame in her posture. No fear in her reflection. He set the table for dinner, and when she joined him, he passed the bread without looking directly at her. Not out of avoidance, but out of understanding. Some things were still too delicate to be touched head-on. The meal was simple. Potatoes. Beans. A slice of salted pork. But it felt like a feast. They ate with the sound of the rain returning lightly outside. The fire crackled behind them. The storm no longer felt like something to endure, it felt like a companion, like a song the sky was singing just for them. When she rose to clear the plates, he didn't stop her. She moved through the space with purpose, her movements no longer small. She was not a guest here anymore. That night, before sleep, she stood at the window again and watched the storm drift eastward, taking its shadows with it. The land was soaked, yes, but alive. Ready. And so was she. Not healed. Not yet. But mending. Quietly. Relentlessly. In the way only those who have known darkness truly can. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, stretching long beams of light across the wet fields where the earth still steamed with the memory of rain. It cast a golden haze over the land, softening the broken fence posts and painting every dewdrop with fire. The cabin stood quiet, its walls dark against the morning, its windows fogged gently by the warmth inside. The silence held, but it was no longer a silence of tension or distance. It was the breath between verses, the pause that lets the soul catch up with the body. She stood at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped around herself, watching as the world came alive. Birds stirred in the trees. The wind carried the scent of wet pine and something almost sweet. It felt like the kind of morning that had waited for her. Not the other way around. Inside, he stirred, his boots heavy against the wood floor. But she didn't move. She stayed still and let the moment root itself inside her. The chores came as they always did, feeding the horse, checking the traps, hauling wood, but today they felt different. Not easier, not lighter, but more shared. When he handed her the basket of eggs from the henhouse, his fingers brushed hers. Just for a second. Not in a way that claimed anything, not in a way that demanded, but as if to say, "You are here, and I see that." She nodded, not because he needed the gesture, but because she finally understood what it meant to be acknowledged without being examined. They worked side by side, repairing the garden fence, the midday sun warming the backs of their necks. When they paused for water, she looked out over the land and felt it differently. She had been here for weeks now, long enough for her presence to settle, long enough for the cabin to hold her scent, for the ground to recognize her step. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a burden passed from hand to hand. She was here, and here was becoming hers. Later that afternoon, a wagon rolled into the edge of the field. She stiffened at the sound, the creak of old wood, the jingle of harness. Her hands stilled on the washboard. Her eyes darted to his face. But he didn't react with alarm. He placed the bucket down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked out to meet the visitor. She stayed on the porch, heart-thudding, waiting. The man in the wagon wasn't anyone she knew. His face was lined, his beard white, his clothes threadbare but clean. He spoke quietly, tipping his hat. She couldn't hear the words. But she watched the way the two men stood, shoulders even, no tension. She could tell there was no threat. Still, she didn't breathe fully until the wagon turned and rolled away. When he came back to the porch, he sat on the step beside her. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in linen. He offered it to her without ceremony. She took it slowly, fingers unwrapping the cloth. Inside was a mirror. Not new. Not polished. The edges were worn, the silver backing slightly cracked. But it was whole. And it was hers. She looked into it, really looked. Her eyes, darker than she remembered. Her cheekbones more defined. The scar above her brow had faded into something faint, like a story told long ago. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply looked. And for the first time in her life, she didn't flinch. That night, they sat by the fire and shared bread and soup. The flames danced in the hearth, casting warm light across the walls. The silence between them was rich, full of meaning without weight. Outside, the stars blinked into view, one by one, like old friends returning after a long absence. She rose to clear the table. He stood too, picking up the lantern. Together, they stepped out onto the porch. The wind had died. The night was still. The moon cast a path across the fields, silver on green. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if this would last forever or if the world would find them again. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity: she was no longer the girl on the platform. She was no longer a name carved into wood. She was no longer a label. She was herself. Quietly, fully, completely. And as he turned to go back inside, holding the door open without a word, she stepped through it, not as something broken, not as something claimed, but as someone finally stepping into her own life.